I still remember the exact moment I realized I had just admitted a dead patient. It was a freezing November night, and I was 6 months into my first year as a junior doctor at an old NHS hospital in Yorkshire. The kind of place with long, dimly lit corridors that smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables, where the heating never worked properly, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps. I was working the night shift on a medical assessment unit, and it had been one of those shifts where you don't even have time to think. Patients were flooding in from A&E, the phones wouldn't stop ringing, and I was already 4 admissions behind. This story was originally shared in a discussion thread on the Doctors UK subreddit, and I'm telling it now because I still can't explain what happened that night, no matter how hard I try. Around 1:30 in the morning, I got handed another set of notes. Bed 7. An elderly gentleman, Mr. Albert Finch, 78 years old, admitted with shortness of breath and confusion. I grabbed my stethoscope and walked down the corridor toward the bay. The ward was quiet except for the occasional cough or the beeping of a monitor somewhere in the distance. I pulled back the curtain around bed 7, and there he was, a thin man with white hair, sitting upright against the pillows, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. His eyes were open, watching me as I stepped closer. I introduced myself, told him I was one of the doctors, and asked how he was feeling. He didn't say much, just nodded slowly and stared at me with pale blue eyes that seemed tired, so incredibly tired. His skin was cold when I touched his wrist to feel his pulse. I remember thinking he must have been sitting near a draft. His pulse was there, faint but regular. I listened to his chest, heard some crackles at the bases of his lungs, nothing unusual for someone his age with a bit of fluid overload. I asked him a few questions. Could he tell me his name? Where he lived? What year it was? His answers were slow, quiet, but appropriate. Albert Finch. Lived on Bramley Road. It's 2018. Everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as it gets at 2 in the morning on a medical ward. I made a few notes in his chart. Adjust his oxygen, start some 4 fluids, get some bloods in the morning, keep an eye on his respiratory rate. Standard stuff. I told him to rest, that we'd look after him, and I pulled the curtain closed again. I moved on to the next patient, then the next. By the time I finished my admission round, it was nearly 4 in the morning. I handed over my jobs to the nurse in charge, grabbed a cup of terrible vending machine coffee, and collapsed into a chair in the doctor's office. My shift ended at 8, and I couldn't wait to get out of there. Morning handover was always chaos. A cramped room full of exhausted doctors passing on information about overnight admissions to the day team. I sat near the back, half asleep, listening to people rattle off patient names and diagnoses. Then the consultant, Dr. Greaves, a sharp woman in her 50s with no patience for nonsense, looked down at the handover sheet and frowned. She tapped her pen against the paper and said, "Who admitted the patient in bed 7? My stomach dropped. I raised my hand. She looked at me, confused, and said, "Bed 7 was empty overnight. The previous patient died there at 11:15 last night. We hadn't allocated it yet." The room went completely silent. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. I shook my head and said no, that couldn't be right. I'd admitted Mr. Albert Finch to bed 7 around 1:30. I'd spoken to him, examined him, written up his notes. Dr. Greaves held up the paper and said there was no record of any admission to bed 7. No A&E referral, no paperwork, nothing. Someone else checked the computer system. Bed 7 showed as empty since the previous patient, a woman named Dorothy Marsh, had passed away from pneumonia just after 11. I felt like I was going to be sick. I stood up and said I'd go check the notes. Maybe there was a clerical error. Maybe I'd written the wrong bed number. I practically ran back to the ward, my heart hammering in my chest. I went straight to the bay and pulled back the curtain around bed 7. The bed was empty, completely empty. Stripped down to the mattress, no sheets, no pillows, no patient. I stood there staring at it, my hands shaking. I could still picture him sitting there. I could still hear his voice, quiet and tired, telling me his name. I could still feel the coldness of his wrist under my fingertips. I went to the nurse's station and asked the nurse on duty, Claire, if she'd seen the patient in bed 7 during the night. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. She said bed 7 had been empty all night, that they were waiting for it to be deep cleaned before admitting anyone new. I asked if she'd seen me go in there around 1:30, if she'd seen me talking to someone. She shook her head slowly and said she'd seen me go into the bay, yes, but I was alone. She'd watched me sit down, write notes, talk to myself for about 10 minutes, then leave. She thought I was just tired. maybe rehearsing what I was going to write in the notes. I felt the floor tilt under me. I told her that was impossible. I'd spoken to him. I'd examined him. I'd written everything down. She asked if I still had the notes. I looked down at the clipboard in my hands. There they were. A full page of handwritten notes. Patient name, age, history, examination findings, treatment plan. All in my handwriting. All written in blue ink. I showed her the notes, and her face went pale. She took the clipboard from me and stared at it, then looked back at the empty bed. She whispered, "This isn't possible." We went back to the doctor's office together. Dr. Greaves was still there, finishing up handover. Claire handed her the notes I'd written. Dr. Greaves read them in silence, her frown deepening with every line. Then she said, "Where did you get this name?" "Albert Finch." I told her the patient told me. That's what he said his name was. She stood up, went to the computer, and typed something in. After a moment, she turned the screen toward me. It was a patient record. Albert Finch. Date of birth matched what I'd written. Address, Bramley Road, just like he'd told me. But the record was flagged. Deceased. Date of death, November 2015. 3 years ago. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Dr. Greaves scrolled down and found his last admission notes. He'd been admitted to the same ward, the same hospital, in November 2015 with shortness of breath and confusion. He'd died 2 days later. The bed number listed in his final notes was bed 7. I looked at Claire. She looked at me. No one said anything for what felt like an eternity. Dr. Greaves finally closed the screen and said, "I think you need to take a break. Go home. Get some sleep. We'll talk about this later." But I couldn't let it go. I went to the hospital library during my next shift and looked up everything I could find about Albert Finch. I found his death certificate, his medical records, even an obituary in the local paper. Everything matched. The man I had spoken to, examined, written notes about, had been dead for 3 years. I asked some of the older nurses if they remembered him. One of them, a woman named Margaret who'd been working on that ward for over 20 years, remembered him well. She said he was a kind man, a bit confused toward the end, but always polite. She said he died alone in bed 7 in the early hours of the morning. No family, no visitors. Just him and the night staff. I asked her if anyone else had ever reported seeing him. She went quiet for a moment, then nodded. She said that over the years, a few staff members had mentioned strange things happening around bed 7. Curtains moving when there was no draft. Call bells ringing when no one was in the bed. One nurse said she'd heard someone coughing in there in the middle of the night, even though the bed was empty. But no one had ever reported a full conversation, a full examination like I had. Margaret looked at me seriously and said, "Maybe he was waiting for someone to actually listen." I went back to bed 7 one more time before I left that week. It was the middle of the day, sunlight streaming through the windows, other patients chatting in the neighboring beds. I stood at the foot of the empty bed and tried to make sense of it. I wasn't tired that night, not delirious, not imagining things. I had physical notes written in my own hand, with details I couldn't have known. His address, his date of birth, even the fact that he had a small scar on his left forearm, which I'd noted during the examination and later found documented in his old records. I hadn't looked up his records before I examined him. I didn't even know who he was. Some of my colleagues think I must have seen his name somewhere, maybe on an old list, maybe in a computer screen I glanced at without realizing. They think my brain filled in the gaps, created a false memory during a stressful shift. But that doesn't explain the notes. It doesn't explain the fact that I wrote down details I couldn't have known. It doesn't explain why the bed was warm when I leaned over to examine him, or why I could feel his pulse, faint and regular, under my fingers. I requested a transfer to a different ward a few weeks later. I told myself it was for career development, more experience, better training. But the truth is, I couldn't walk past bed 7 anymore without feeling a chill run down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me that night, those pale blue eyes, tired and sad, as if he'd been waiting for someone to see him. I kept wondering if he'd been there all along, sitting in that bed, night after night, hoping someone would stop and listen. I still work at the same hospital. I see the medical assessment unit sometimes when I'm passing through, and I always glance toward that bay. Bed 7 is just a bed now, filled with real patients, real cases. But I can't shake the memory. I can't forget the feeling of his cold skin, the sound of his quiet voice, the way he nodded when I told him we'd look after him. I've read about similar experiences, other doctors and nurses who've reported seeing patients who weren't there, hearing voices, feeling presences. Some people think it's stress, exhaustion, the brain playing tricks. Others think it's something else, something we don't fully understand. A few months ago, I ran into Margaret again in the hospital cafeteria. She asked how I was doing, if I'd settled into my new ward. I told her I was fine, but I couldn't help asking if anything else had happened around bed 7. She smiled sadly and said no, not recently. Then she leaned in closer and said, I think he just needed to know someone cared. Maybe that's why he appeared to you. Maybe you gave him what he was waiting for. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Maybe I did see his name somewhere, and my subconscious filled in the rest. Maybe the whole thing was some kind of waking dream, and I wrote those notes without realizing what I was doing. But deep down, I know what I experienced. I know I spoke to him. I know I examined him. I know he was there. And I know that when I left that bay and pulled the curtain closed, he was still sitting there, watching me leave, his pale blue eyes following me as I walked away. I don't talk about it much anymore. Most people don't believe me, and I don't blame them. I'm not sure I'd believe me either if I hadn't been there. But every now and then, when I'm working a night shift and the ward is quiet, I think about Albert Finch sitting alone in bed 7, waiting for someone to see him. I think about how cold his skin was, how tired his eyes looked, and I wonder if he's still there. I wonder if he's still waiting. Even now, I can't walk past that bed without feeling like someone is watching me. Even now, I wonder if it was real, or if my mind created something I desperately needed to believe. But the notes are still there, filed away in the archives, written in my own handwriting, describing a man who had been dead for 3 years. And that's something I'll never be able to explain. What do you think? Was it exhaustion, or was it something else? Something that crosses the line between life and death, something that waits in the quiet hours of a hospital night, hoping someone will finally listen?